Welcome to the BFI London Film Festival. I'm Sarah Perks, your host for today, and this is a really special screen talk, the very first one ever, for our new strand, which is LFF Expanded. And this is about everything XR and immersive art, removing all forms of physical boundaries and putting the audience right in the middle. So the choice of artists for our first LFF Expanded screen talk is absolutely perfect. Her amazing body of work spills across disciplines, across worlds, redefining how we might understand the relationship between sculpture and immersive experiences. So Es Devlin is an artist and stage designer with so many fantastic projects, it's hard to know where to start. She created the set for the London Olympics closing ceremony. Her award-winning theatre set designs have graced stages all over the world. She has pop music concert collaborations with Adele, Kanye West, my favorite, Miley Cyrus, with coming out of a huge own tongue. There's been fashion and opera, and more recently, Ez is getting a lot of attention for her impressive, detailed, and intelligent contemporary art installations. So because we're here as part of a screen talk series, I thought we would start with thinking about how your role might connect maybe to that of a film director. So film directors often construct a kind of self-contained environment, it's a collaboration, and there's usually like a cast of sorts. And your work is often based on talking to large-scale audiences, but creating a real intimacy. How do you describe your role?
Yeah, I mean, it's taken different days, different descriptions, but I would say fundamentally, if you wanted to try and encapsulate what I and my studio do, it's effectively turning ideas into forms, trying to take something that's abstract and lacking in material, unless you count the neural synaptic connection sorts as material. It's taking that and giving it concrete form. So it's often a very contrasting series of processes. So it will begin with shaping thought in air, usually between a number of people. So it often starts with a primary source, a text, or a song, or a story. And then it'll move into conversation, passing that text or that song or that story between people, and a conjuring of ideas in air, in breath, in sound, in words, in things that you can change like that. And that's the most gorgeous, enjoyable thing, that you can construct whole possibilities in air and then in a moment swivel them around and turn them upside down, and they can change. And then, of course, things develop, things get drawn, things get extruded, expanded, built in 3 dimensions. And then suddenly you're looking at a whole load of heavy, brutal, concrete, metal, wood objects that then are very intractable and that won't take persuasion, and that are there and have to be dealt with. The beginning of their life has to be accounted for, the end of their life has to be accounted for. And that could not be more contrasting with the beginning of the process. So yeah, it's a life of extremes in some ways.
And do you create it with a sort of, an intimacy or one kind of person in mind, or do you think about a kind of vast audience?
I guess there's this crazy paradox at the heart of the experience of a mass gathering. And I must emphasize that right now, of course, this is an extinct medium, a temporarily, we hope, extinct medium. So it's sort of with extra clarity, I guess, that we're looking at our practice because it's currently in a state of temporary hibernation or extinction. And it's with great sadness that we look at it, but also with some clarity of distance, because we're not in the middle of it. But those gatherings of, say, 100,000 people or of 20,000 people, there's a paradox to it, because each individual person is there to have a one-to-one, one-on-one communication, right? They've come because they know every song that artist is going to go and sing. They have their own sort of beaded necklace of memories associated with that song. And that just is running on like a sort of acupuncture chakra line through their body, through their mind, through their memory. And yet it expands out sideways because everybody's having that experience and they know that they're having it communally. So they're sort of swaying together with the beat, the breath, the intake, the outtake of breaths that, you know, are the songs. And yet it's running in that other Z dimension through them, through their personal memory. So it's a very, very special and beautiful combination of one-to-one all together at the same time.
I've been really admiring your statement as artistic director for next year's London Design Biennale, and hopefully it will take place. And the theme that you have brought up is resonance. Can you tell us a little bit about this idea?
It's really interesting because that word resonance came from, again, an effort to give names. I love giving names to things. I often change them, but as the names evolve, I find my understanding of things evolves. And at the time, I was actually doing a talk with Jeremy Deller, and we called it Voice Space. We were talking, he was really investigating what does music look like? And I started through his lens, through the help of his lens, to view my own 20-year practice as actually a series of making musical instruments. That in a way, these big kinetic sculptures that I was making are a way of playing the music visually. So I started to think about objects that resonate, objects that pass energy and meaning on. And of course, you know, I then read the book that's become a real guide to me at the moment by Mark Wigley and Beatrice Colomina called Are We Human? They're two extraordinary design philosophers from MIT who wrote these kind of field notes on the archaeology of the feedback loops between the artifacts that humans produce and the design of humans themselves. And their proposal, which I think makes a lot of sense to me, is that every time a human designed an object, the object in some way redesigned the human. So the humans designed the flints redesigned the humans designed the smartphones redesigned the humans. And there's this mutable species of us that's constantly being redesigned and redefined by the objects that we designed. So what we were really looking at there is this word design. And again, Mark and Beatrice are very, very succinct on this. They say, listen, this word design has sort of come to stand in for good, right? You say designer hotel, designer interiors, designer drugs, designer this, designer holidays, as if designer just means good. But of course, guns are designed, prisons are designed, taxes designed, penal codes are designed, all sorts of things are designed that don't bring about the evolution or the benefit of the species. So to really examine this word design, and as designers, because my role as artistic director of the London Design Biennale is to try and sort of provide a context for a whole group of designers who are coming from all over the planet to London, we hope, in June. And to take responsibility for really, because we design stuff. You know, there's this wonderful story of a lecture where somebody asks a room full of designers, you know, in the lecture, who thinks there should be less stuff on the planet? And all the designers put their hands up, but they're busy designing stuff. So yeah, it's on us as designers to, you know, design in a circular way, to design the end of the life of an object and not just the beginning.
Yeah, because you, in the description, you mention about the kind of consequences of this sort of hyper resonance, which are both exhilarating and devastating. So I'd like to think about the more positive applications that you employ in here. And I sort of read it as a call to arms to fuse ideas of repair and regeneration with technology's latest innovations. How do you want to meet that challenge?
Look, the really positive thing is that we are behaving instinctively as a species in a more and more connected way. You know, the cures for diseases, if you look at the work that's going on around the planet and the exchange of ideas that's happening across borders that never would have happened before, the speed at which we can find solutions that we need to find globally, you know, that's a massive benefit, isn't it, of the advances in global communications. There is so much that is positive about it. And I think, you know, the fact that everyone's turning their attention to design and what it needs to be. I'm thinking of Dame Ellen MacArthur, who actually, we just awarded the Innovation Medal at the London Design Festival Medal Awards. And to my shame, I hadn't researched thoroughly into Ellen MacArthur before and what she's done. But that, I mean, that's a story worth telling. Here's a woman who, aged 28, got on a boat on her own, circumnavigated the entire globe in 72 days. And then you think, right, 28 is such an important age, isn't it? And at 28, there she is on her own on her boat. And what's she thinking about? She's thinking about this planet because she's actually going around it. And now she's retired and she's devoting her entire practice at the moment to perpetuating ideas about the circular economy and about circular design. So she's a yachtswoman, right? She's talking to designers. So, you know, design has ceased to be this enclosed box of people, you know, determining what it is that what are the objects we will interact with? What are the objects that will end up on our landfill, right? They can't work in isolation. That has to be an interaction with everybody who's got a, you know, I mean, as Timothy Morton brilliantly says, the eco-philosopher, he says, there is no away. You know, we talk about throwing things away. There is no away. There's no away, you know, and that's been a huge evolution in our thought. When I was a kid, we thought we threw things away. Now we know there is no away.
Yeah, we always thought that progress was something that would keep going, that there wouldn't be an end, that things would continue. I also love how this connects to the vast artwork that you created last year for the Pitt's Hanger Manor and Gallery in London, a piece called Memory Palace. And it's a big kind of 18 meters wide, made of bamboo sculpture. And it's also a map of human history. So within this, you put significant moments you selected, including kind of prehistoric cave drawings to the steps where Greta Thunberg did the first climate strike. I just really got into it because as a curator, my strategy is about putting kind of, you know, seemingly disparate objects together to create new dialogues. Can you tell us a bit about your journey of how you approach creating Memory Palace?
Well, listen, I'm so glad you asked about that work in little old Pitt's Hanger in Ealing. And, you know, what's extraordinary is the number of people who actually got out there and saw it. So I'm super grateful to that. Listen, it was a remarkably uncasual endeavor. When John Leslie, the curator at Pitt's Hanger, said, you know, here's a beautiful room, Anish Kapoor has just done this wonderful work, what do you want to do? And I sort of had this idea. To be honest, memory palaces are something I've been thinking about since I was 16 years old, and my English teacher gave me a book about them called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. And I guess always I've been fascinated in the turning of the abstract and the purely cerebral into the concrete. And architecture has always felt like a fantastic place to try and express that fascination. And a memory palace, just those two words, the abstractive memory and the concrete palace, just put those two words together and I'm happy. But this was a work really made, again, in response to the reading I'd done of Timothy Morton's work on eco-philosophy and a writer called David Abram, who I've become very interested in, he's actually an eco-philosopher who was originally a sleight of hand magician. And he's written a book called The Spell of the Sensuous and another one called Becoming Animal, which I highly recommend. And Timothy Morton's advice is, at the time, and I don't know if it's changed, but his advice really was to artists, if they want to try and be of any use in resonating and propagating ideas around the shifts that humans need to go through to make their stay on this planet more sustainable and longer. His advice was stop preaching and start amazing. He said, you're not going to get anywhere by preaching to us. Just please amaze us. As artists, please amaze us. And I took that note, and then I thought, well, what if I could also offer some kind of consolation and say, listen, as a species, we have shifted our perspective. You know, it feels hard. I remember reading Naomi Klein's extraordinary book, This Changes Everything, in 2013 on climate. And at that time, it's really interesting. If you reread the beginning of that book, she says at the very start of the book, you think about climate change and then you think about something else for a while. And then you come back and you think about climate change and then you think about something else. And actually, since 2013, we've evolved quite a lot. And really what she was talking about in that book is she was trying to give us examples of when we have, as a species, shifted our perspective. And she was giving the abolition of slavery as an example, which I know is fraught with complication because there's many instances in which it's still not abolished, but still the traces of it are still with us. But she uses that as a useful example. And I wanted to sort of take that spirit and go, okay, let's go through our entire history of 73 millennia and think about all the times, in my humble opinion, and that of my studio, it's a very personal approach, that really minds did shift. I mean, we used to think the earth was flat, and now most of us don't. We used to think the sun revolved around us, and most of us now don't. And there was a moment, right? And I wanted to help us, concretize those moments. So I found, the tower in Fromberg, in which Copernicus sat and drew that diagram from which everything changed. And that there are these moments. And that helps us to realize that it could be us. It could be you in that room that you're sitting in now that writes something that just shifts on the protractor, that tiny degree that then takes the whole of our species in a slightly different direction. And if we all think like that, there's a responsibility taken. So yeah, it was a map of human perspective shift located in 73 different locations. And then it took the form of a huge concave, as if you were inside a globe with the architecture protruding on the inside, so huge white space, and you yourself were the protagonist in it because there was a vast mirror. So you really saw yourself in the context of all these shifts of thought. So yeah, I'm really glad that you saw it.
I also love another thing that you said, where you say, I realized you can't walk through a film. Wouldn't it be great if you could cut a hole in a film and enter it yourself? And for me, your work is actually sort of all about the holes and the gaps, about revealing light or perhaps manipulating light and space. Again, this reminded me a bit of the essence of cinema, which is really a manipulation of light. But your work sort of pushes that into new places, across kind of stages, into installations, into a sort of more active space. Do you have a philosophy about particularly your use of light in your work and through these holes?
Listen, you've touched on some really important things there, which I'd like to pick off one by one and talk about because they're really fundamental to what I and we in the studio do. I was working on an opera, a wonderful Janacek opera, very, very beautiful, called The Cunning Little Vixen, in Copenhagen. And I was rather, I have to say, me and my team, we were quite proud of ourselves. We were doing, it must have been the early 2000s, because we were projection mapping in a way that we thought was relatively avant-garde at the time. And we had made the whole set out of layers of cutout paper, and there was projection. We thought technically we're doing something interesting here. And then on an evening off, we went to see The Life of Pi. And I sort of, at the end of the film, turned to my video designer colleague and I said, my goodness, I'm looking at all the credits, but where are the lion tamers? Where are the animal trainers? And he just, of course, laughed out loud and said, you completely, the whole thing. I said, no, I mean, the real ones. He said, no, there weren't any reals. I said, no, come on. There must have been some real animals in this thing. He said, no, they're all fabric. And I had this crisis and I just went, shit, there's us with our bits of paper and our little projectors. And then I had a little moment and I thought, well, how would I graft onto this film that I've just seen? I thought it was a fabulous film, but wouldn't it be great if we could cut a hole in it? So that at the end of the film, or in the middle of the film, a tiger came out of the hole, and perforated this beautiful square of moving light. And, I often think about films like that. It is in terms of phenomenology, in terms of, the material that we're actually looking at. It's a screen with a block of moving light for a period of time. So yeah, I started thinking about it sculpturally and saying, well, what if you could perforate that? And yeah, that sense of cutting through a film or being able to perforate, being able to walk to the other side, it's something I've been playing with pretty much always. And it's the way I start every day, in fact, because I have this little ritual where when I wake up in the morning, wherever I am, in the in the previous pre-extinction of my practice days, when I used to travel, I used to wake up in different hotel rooms. But of course, now I wake up in Dulwich every day, which is also nice. But the first thing I see is this slot of light in various hotels. Sometimes it's very, very beautiful. You know, the ones in LA are particularly beautiful because they're very bright, and you just see it through the hotel curtains. You know, there's the layer of the thin ones and the layer of the thicker ones, and if you close them in just the right way, you know, you're going to have this beautiful, like Fontana-like slash of light in the morning. My ones in Dulwich are a little bit like a sort of frame of light around the blinds. But that, I go on about this only because it is sort of fundamental to everything else I do. You know, most of the time we sit in a dark theatre and, you know, we decide where we're going to open those little apertures. And it's I guess, a gesture towards seeing beyond, trying to peel back a layer and see beyond the immediate set of material circumstances into things that kind of transcend them, I guess. And yeah, it relates to stained glass windows. It relates to Fontana, a massive influence on my practice, slashing through the canvas of the painting. But yeah, apertures and perforations and shaping of light has always been really, really important.
And let's talk a bit about another commission that you did recently for the Imperial War Museum with your long-term collaborator, Machiko Weston. It's called I Saw the World End, and you made this for the 75 years since the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is a very hard-hitting, quite emotional piece of work, and it also involves quite contemporary messages around racism and climate change. What was your, joint vision for this project, and how did you sort of find these issues are related 75 years ago, the, kind of disaster that happened, and then what's going on now?
Listen, this was an invitation that came out of the blue in a way. The Imperial War Museum asked me to make a piece in response to Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't feel equipped or really that I had the authority to speak about this. I thought, God, there's so many more people who know so much more about this than I do. But I took it to Machiko, who's been working with me in the studio for 12 years, who's Japanese. And I said, listen, you and I have never spoken about this. What if we have a go? And I said, how about if we're separated for the first time in 12 years? You're working in your studio in Borough. I literally haven't seen Machiko hardly for 6 months. So she did all her research in Japanese, only Googling in Japanese. I did all my research in English. And it was really her that came up with stuff that I didn't find at all in my searches, particularly the letters that President Harry Truman had written to his future wife when he was 19, he was in his early 20s. And he clearly demonstrated, through no fault of his own, through the context in which he was brought up, a profound, ingrained racism. And the interesting point was, could one bring this to bear on the decision to, inflict this bomb? So that was something we wanted to explore. Also, what was fascinating that I had no clue of until we started researching it was the influence of fiction over fact. This is what I found really extraordinary, was that H.G. Wells had written The World Set Free, a novel which envisages nuclear power before it was invented. He had conjured it, he'd envisaged it. And Leo Szilard, a Hungarian emigre physicist, had read H.G. Wells. And when he read that book, he was actually in the middle of working with Einstein on some research into refrigeration that he felt going anywhere. So he dumped his fridge and decided instead to concentrate on nuclear power. And he was actually in London, walking across a traffic light at Southampton Row. And it was while he was waiting for the traffic light and watching the lights change that he describes it, that he had this moment of thinking about nuclear chain reaction. That's where it came to him. He then was so terrified about how the Germans might use this. He was convinced that they'd already were racing to make a bomb, that he then wrote to Einstein, who then wrote to Roosevelt to say, listen, we better get on with this, because if we don't make a bomb, they're going to. And that's what led to the Manhattan Project. And that's what led to Hiroshima. So, perversely, Leo Szilard, of course, realized this was happening, and he and Einstein desperately wrote and tried to say, look, whatever you do it on some uninhabited island. Don't drop it on human beings. But really what we ended up doing was, again, using this line of light that we were just talking about. This is sort of dividing the screen along this line. And weirdly, we came to that line, not least because we designed the film to be made in Piccadilly Circus, to be shown in Piccadilly Circus on the big screen. And they have a stipulation with that screen that you must always divide it into 6 parts. I think it must be an English heritage thing, that because it was originally lots of small screens, when they allowed them to put that beautiful huge screen, they said, oh, well, so that it fits in with our heritage, we must always keep it small. I'm second guessing that, but I think that's where it must come from. So we were trying to get around this. And I said, well, look, let's divide it in half with this line. And that, of course, became a sort of fundamental principle of the film. And then, as Machiko puts it, it's 2 different points of view. Always. It's a point of view from the survivor's perspective, and then a point of view from the perspective of those who thought they were doing the right thing. And constantly your eye, when you're reading and listening to the film, you have to keep crossing the line. You as a viewer have to cross from one side of the argument to the other. And it's really a sort of evocation of that, constantly trying to look through the perspective of others, and that the only hope for reconciliation of any kind, or peace of any kind, is crossing that line between 2 points of view, going into the uncomfortable space on the other side of the border of your own context. So that's really the essence that it took. Yeah. And climate change, of course, there's a wonderful philosopher who's been studying the tandem parallel paths of climate change and nuclear warfare. And there are a lot of parallels to be drawn. There's a lot of parallels to be recognized in the ability of the power we now have to orchestrate our own extinction, and the collective effort it's going to take to step back from the brink of that.
Yeah, and it reminded me of the sort of notion of haunting as well, and how these things still exist in our time, but not necessarily just to kind of, haunt and scare in a way that writers like Avery Gordon talk about haunting, but to sort of influence us, to remind us, to kind of hold on to something from the past, but take it into the future to make it relevant now. Did you think about those kind of concepts in the work?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, in a way, it was a shame that 2 days before we were due to show this film on the 6th of August, the exact 75 years, 8 a.m. since the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, on the Tuesday night, of course, there was that profoundly tragic explosion in Beirut. And we made the decision collectively not to show our work out of respect for those victims, which it was a valid decision. But on the other hand, you could argue, and some people did, that actually making those connections between, a visual parallel. Yes, whenever we saw that huge mushroom cloud on the Tuesday night in Beirut, of course, we made a connection. And those things are not unrelated. There was a carelessness. People thought they were doing the right thing in storing whatever they were storing in those buildings in Beirut, or whatever reasons they did it for, which I'm sure had logic associated with them at the time. But clearly there was a carelessness, there was a lack of consideration for human life, which led to that. And there are parallels. And it brought it home, and we have to remember, we have to learn. We can only learn from remembering these things. Otherwise, our process of evolution is hampered by our lack of engaging with our own memory palace, right, as a species. So, I think it's incredibly important to, and those, survivors' words are incredibly potent. We just read out the words of the Hibakushi, the Nagasaki and Hiroshima survivors, and we have something to learn from them. Not just in relation to nuclear power, but to nuclear weapons, but in relation to climate change. We have something to learn from those who felt they were about to see the world end, or they felt they saw the world end. We have a lot. They're very precious to us. And by the way, they're not going to be alive much longer. So, that we're reaching this point where if we want to cling on to that one-to-one oral history, we must listen to them while we can.
Yeah. Let's do the part of the talk where we chat about how you got into everything. How was there a childhood moment, for example, that you realized you wanted to be an artist and a designer?
I was, I guess, as a kid, interested always in. I mean, to be honest with you, there wasn't a right lot laid on when we were kids. That was, as you remember, well, you don't remember because you're too young, but there were 3 TV channels. There was BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV, and I don't think they really started till 5 p.m. So, I think if you were off sick and you watched telly in the afternoon, it was the Open University or Pebble. There was a thing called Pebble Mill, which was really boring. So, you had to find stuff to do.
I remember there was a girl with a chalkboard for many hours.
That's right. So I'm just saying that, we or the thing, if you had a recording of anything that came out of my mouth, when I was a kid, and me and my 3 siblings, most of the time we were just saying we're bored. That's all we said was we're bored. We're bored. We're bored. We were mainly bored. And of course, our parents, who were trying to work, trying to bring up 4 kids, would just say, well, entertain yourselves. So I guess a lot of my practice did derive from that, as is true of my own children now and of children everywhere. There's nothing distinct about that. But the materials that we had happened to be, the back of cereal packets. And I was always taken. I think we mustn't underestimate the amount of time that kids spend reading the back of cereal packets, right? I mean, I watch my own kids now, and they can endlessly read the same back of the same cereal packet. And I do think this is an opportunity we should be putting fabulously important. We should have like a slider on the back of a cereal packet where we could change the information every day. But anyway, the things I liked was when you saw a little dotted line and a tiny little drawing of a pair of scissors around it, because that meant as soon as you scoffed all the cereal, I mean, of course, I love the ones with the free gift. You could put your hand inside and get that out. But, the dotted line meant you could intervene. And I loved it when you cut the back of the cereal packet and on the inside was some new print that you hadn't seen. And it was, these things sound simple, but they're kind of at the core of everything we're talking about, of apertures and layers of inside and outside. And I think there's some fundamentals there. But so yeah, I always enjoyed sort of intervening on material objects around me. And I always enjoyed light. We had a little dark place under our stairs in the house where we lived. And it was at the time where you had those, slideshow viewfinder things, those little red plastic viewmasters. And you could actually get one as a projector, which was very magical for us, that you could project these images on the wall. It was, spend hours looking at those type of things. So maybe the seeds of that kind of stuff were always there. But it took me a long time, it took me a really long time. I felt very unconfident when I got to the sort of higher grades in school. I noticed there were people ready to go to art school, and I looked around the art schools and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be extraordinary to know that you could sit in this studio and feel able to say something? And I thought, God, I wouldn't know what to say. Anything that I might say would just be not worth saying yet. I didn't feel that I had anything really worth saying. So that's one of the reasons I didn't elect to sort of take that studio route of education, but really opted for a route that was much more didactic, I guess, or much more a sense of fueling my imagination by studying literature for 3 years. That, was a sort of endless source of fuel, I guess, to use that word again. But I still draw on it, I still, even yesterday, a poem from Keats came into my mind that I probably hadn't read since I was about 19. So I do think that is valuable to stack up as much while your brain is in that state of taking things on board. The more that piece of education can be a lifetime supply of of roads or doors that you can open in the future. So if you just plant a whole load of doors that later you might want to open. So that was the education. But I was so engaged in education that education sort of became my job. Except I wasn't being paid, obviously, which was a source of great annoyance to the people around me. So eventually, pressure, especially from my boyfriend's dad, who just said, you can't live off him anymore. You do need to get a job. So at that point, I thought about theatre, and a lot of people said to me, listen, don't go there. You'll never make any money. You must do TV. So I thought about various things, and really a lot of decisions I've made in my life have come through the quality of interaction with a room, actually. A lot of those early experiences when you go for a job when you're sort of 18 and you don't, or 16, whatever age you are, you walk into the room and you go, how do I feel in this room? How do I feel with these people? What does it smell like? Does it feel good? Could I come here tomorrow? Could I come here every day? And I walked into a room which happened to be a design course called the Motley Theatre Design Course. And honestly, I wasn't a big theatre fan. I found most of it, to be brutally honest, quite cringy and embarrassing. Most of the time I'd gone to theatre, I just felt embarrassed. Like when when they started that, I was like, oh no, again, So, my experience of theatre was like Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals, which, there's some very good ones, but I went to see all of them, and not all of them were as good as the best ones. And the Ryan Hastings pantomime. That's what I'd seen of theatre. So it wasn't like I was I wasn't in school plays, wasn't any of that. It was more that I just walked into this room and there was about 10 students there, and they were feral. Clearly they'd not slept. Clearly they'd been living in this place, not leaving it. It was a 24-hour studio. It kind of stank. I think I saw a mouse, or certainly some mouse droppings. There was pot noodles. And they were fiddling around with models, little scale models of things, and they were reading books, and there was bookshelves and model boxes and glue. And, I just thought, oh, this is my kind of room. And even if I don't end up wanting to make the stuff that they're making, I'll be happy in this room. I'll be productive and, resourceful in this room. And I really advocate that, actually, to anyone who comes to me around the age of 16 and says, well, I don't know what to do. I just say, walk into as many rooms as you can and stay in the ones that you like the feeling of, The rooms lead to the people, and the people lead to the rooms.
That's really good advice. I will share that with some of my students. Yeah, it really does appear that some of this, or some of your theatre set design is kind of key to understanding your practice. And there was an early defining moment for you where you designed the stage for the National Theatre's revival of Harold Pinter's Betrayal in 1998. How important was that as a moment for you, and how do you look back on it now?
Well, poor Harold. The last thing he needed was me all over his beautiful play, frankly. At that point, I had been very fortunate in that a wonderful theatre director called Mike Bradwell had sort of taken me under his wing at the Bush Theatre, and we'd done a run of plays together. In fact, I say that we'd done a run. I think this was, in fact, the first one. It was the first one, called Love and Understanding, by a wonderful playwright and film screenplay writer called Joe Penhall. So we'd done this piece called Love and Understanding. Trevor Nunn had come to see it, and he invited me straight from that to do this large-scale work of this extraordinary piece of theatre, wonderful piece of writing of Betrayal by Harold Pinter. And of course, what that play really needs is just the most simple environment. He's brilliantly written the environments. It's a room that remembers. It is a memory palace, actually. That was its. It was so unfortunate for Harold that I came across this memory palace in his play, but it's a very interesting piece that shuffles around the order of its scenes in chronology. And I, of course, at the time was very infected with the wonderful work of Rachel Whiteread. She had made this extraordinary house piece in Bow, and it was the imprint of a now dismantled house on a lump of cast concrete. And really, at the time, I guess it's interesting that my sense of authorship was still so unconfident that I actually said to Trevor, listen, I don't think we should do this show on the Littleton stage. I said, this house is the absolute embodiment of this piece. It's a chunk of memory. It is, remembering each of these locations, and sort of, it's the archaeology of a relationship being, excavated between these three characters. And we should just ask Rachel and do it there. We should take the audience and we should project, to bring these sites to life. And I had it all. And I wrote to Rachel, who I didn't know, and said, can we do this? And she was, very dignified and said, yes, of course, you have my blessing. And in the end, of course, it wasn't practical, but we did really, in a very direct homage, we took each of the scenes that this thing takes place in and made these Rachel Whitereadian impressions of them, and then projected on them. And of course, it wasn't enough for me that, these projections would sweep across. I needed all the furniture to sort of be sweeping through the space. So we had, very complicated travelators and, so yeah, it was the right gesture, but probably done with perhaps a little too much enthusiasm, let's say. But yeah, it was an important and very exciting step at the time.
Let's talk about popular music. I actually wanted to be a pop star till I was about 21, which is quite late for a childhood aspiration, I know. So I'm just really excited to find out how you collaborate with musicians and how you approach the, concert experience.
I guess I began with the confidence of a complete innocent / ignorant, because I pretty much designed concerts before I'd really been to concerts. And there would have been many people far better equipped than I in many ways who knew much more about concerts to design the concerts I had the great opportunity to design when I was so ignorant. I guess my experience of concerts when I was a kid was Tunbridge Wells Assembly Halls, and whatever came there is what we saw. So we saw Bucks Fizz and we saw the Nolan Sisters when we were kids. And my brother went down the aisle to try and get near the front. And that's what I thought a pop concert was, really. And then when I was a teenager, we went to see the Boomtown Rats. It was around the time of Live Aid. We were completely taken with Bob Geldof. And that was the first time I really sort of went as a teenager and pushed my way to the front, because I'm quite short. So my main experience of going to a concert is I can't see anything. So, it was a mission to get to the front. And then when I first came to London, someone took me to the Brixton Academy to see the Ramones, and I still had my sort of Tunbridge Wells Assembly Halls method on, and I was just like getting near the front, and he was like, no, I don't think you should do this. The front might not be the safest place for a very short person. So that's what I really knew about gigs. I mean, I went out for a while with someone who was working in music and went to a lot of gigs. So we went to a lot of small gigs in pubs and things, but visually I had not been initiated into some of the extraordinary works of Mark Fisher and the Pink Floyd extraordinary shows, or the David Bowie. I hadn't seen those shows, right? So I just didn't have a great context of visually what had gone on in that sphere. So when I was first invited to make one was in 2003 by the phenomenal Alex Poots, who used to run a extraordinary festival at the Barbican called Only Connect, which kind of, he and I share a lot of opinions about the value of connecting across perhaps unusual boundaries. And this was a band called Wire, a wonderful band, who really were game and up for it. And Dinos and Jake Chapman did the first half, and I did the second half of the show. And I guess I was expressing straight away a desire to try and challenge the standard presentation, because it's all I'd seen. I'd just seen the standard presentation of what kind of annoyed me was that the humans looked so kind of ill-considered against this large frame. So I tried to reduce the frame into this series of smaller frames, and I tried to do a little bit of analysis on, what was actually going on while they played the gig. I was intrigued, what was the drummer's heart rate doing? What was going on in the minds? What was going on in the sort of minutiae of the eyes, the nose, and mouth? So that was the first approach. And I guess subsequently with every show that I've collaborated with a musician, with an artist who's a musician on, it's really been a case of understanding that this is effectively a portrait for them. Willie Williams, the creative director of U2, puts it very well. He says, listen, it's like you're designing their wedding dress. They've got to wear it. Whatever you want, you can express yourself, but they've got to wear the dress. So in a way, these portable architectures are more like garments than environments, you might say. Beyonce's got to wear that thing around the whole planet for 150 shows, in rain, in snow, in sun. It's got to fit her. She's got to feel comfortable in it. It's got to not wear her, So that's been the sort of nature of conversation. Is a bit like you might have if you were, making a portrait of somebody, And in this sense, you're not making a portrait out of paint. You're making a portrait out of pixels, usually. Portable items. It's a very portable medium, and it's weirdly, it's made often out of modules of things which go back into inventory. So actually, if I were to do the analysis of the countless number of pop shows that I've collaborated on over the last 20 years, there's probably a group of LED panels that have been in every show. And there's something rather beautiful about that they, you know, they come out, they go around the world, they come back, they go into their storage unit, they come back. And actually that's true not just of the LED panels, it's true of some of the lifts, some of the pieces of machinery. They go back into an inventory, they come out, they go around, they get reclad, redressed. So yeah, there's something quite interesting to consider there.
Then there's your design of the closing ceremony for the London Olympics. And I love the way here you talked about your research process, and you talked about reading Niall Ferguson's book, The History of the British Empire. And you mentioned that you were looking for kind of inspiration and maybe, you know, exciting things, but actually it's kind of like a bad history, really. How did you deal with that? How did you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the trouble with research, is it sometimes leads you to, you know, dig ever deeper and dig yourself into a hole. If you then, you can often, I mean, I get asked this quite a lot by students actually, when they say, what do you do if, you know, the two things you're trying to elide, your sphere of values and interests and that of your collaborator, what happens when they just misalign, right? And, you know, when you're trying to express a country, which I would call my country, it's the country that, you know, I lived in all my life. It's the country of which I'm a citizen. And yet, of course, you know, we all have to come to terms with the aspects of the history of our country that do not align with our current values. And this was really a journey of uncovering that, I guess, for me, because I was given quite a clear brief on the London Olympic closing ceremony, which was, you have this effectively a big football pitch, and we want you to turn it into a Union Jack flag. And I just thought it was a terrible idea. I thought the whole idea of Olympics was not about, you know, jingoistic nationalism. It was about, you know, ideals beyond that. So I did my best to suggest other ideas, but in the end, this idea had really lodged itself firmly in those who were organizing this event. So I said, okay, it's either don't do it or try to find a way into it. So as always, begin with research. So I went back, and there are actually some extraordinary documents that show the design process of James I's designers as he was coming up with these layers of flags. And he was trying to literally mash these various layers of English and Scottish flags onto each other. And then, of course, later George trying to layer in the Irish flag as well. And it is, you know, that flag itself, unfortunately, is just a kind of history of the overlapping and overtaking, the kind of forcible mashing together of territories. That's what it is. So at the time in 2011, what was interesting is if you Googled Union Jack flag or Union Jack art, really nothing came up. You got Jerry Halliwell's dress, you got the Sex Pistols, and you got a cushion or two and a few Britpop things. But honestly, that was it. It was not something that artists were working with. They weren't. And I will say that changed during the course of 2012 and after it really did. And people really started to explore the flag and not be so terrified of it. And I really had a moment of thinking, okay, what if it's a Damien Hirst spin painting? You know, he kind of is part of this energy of Brit art, Brit pop. He was one I'd had a brief encounter with when I was assisting in 1992 him on an opera project he did in Edinburgh. And he was actually working, his studio was on the street I was working in Peckham. So I went round and asked his team and said, listen, is there a chance? I'd found, and my studio had taken one of his spin paintings and rather audaciously recolored it red, white and blue and said, would you consider this? And I showed him how it would look, and he was into it. And that worked for me. It had the sort of anarchy of, you know, the Sex Pistols torn and safety pinned flag with the champagne cork explosion quality of celebration that we needed. And we were so nervous in the lead up to 2012, if you think about it. You know, I actually had designed a huge cover covered in grey clouds because I was so convinced it was going to pour with rain that I wanted to have this moment of peeling the cover off. Mercifully, we ran out of time and didn't even have time to put it on. But yeah, I think it's a real mark of how we've evolved in our attitude towards that flag since 2012.
Another piece of yours that I really admired from afar, if you like, came out of your long-term collaboration with Louis Vuitton. And it's where you worked at the Niterói Contemporary Art Museum in Rio, in Brazil, or just outside of Rio, because it's one of my favorite buildings. And I think at that moment when I saw what you'd done, I thought, this artist is fearless. You know, you're taking on Oscar Niemeyer's then, you know, groundbreaking architecture. Do you have that sort of same, you know, desire that he had to like break the conventions and the traditions?
Very little credit should go to me on that. Honestly, that building, you stand in the presence of such extraordinary sculptural greatness. And in that country, I was working on the Rio Olympics at the time, and it was a lovely convergence of Vuitton choosing, Nicolas Ghesquière choosing to do his show there, and me sort of being there anyway and getting really deeply involved in the culture with Fernando Moraes, who was directing, and Daniela Thomas and Andrusha Waddington, who were all directing the Olympics there. So, you know, Rio was coursing through me at the time. It was a wonderful period. And yeah, I mean, mercifully, we had a very high building. So my colleagues, Faye McLeod and Ansel Thompson from Louis Vuitton, we were standing up on a very high roof looking down. So we were able to talk to each other and move these seatings around. And each seat had been based on forms and shapes that we derived from, you know, the Burlo Marx, the extraordinary artists, graphic designers, and architects and musicians of that place. But there is quite a funny story that my mum texted me, and this might be the secret to the fearlessness. She said, "My goodness, that was wonderful." She said, "That building," she said, "did you build that, or was it an inflatable?" And so, you know, we were instilled with confidence from a young age. But yeah, it was an absolute pleasure to, and I think what Nicolas did with the clothes there, it was a real poetry in motion that he was, you know, absolutely harmonizing the forms. I mean, he's very inspired by the lines in architecture, and he treats, you know, often the clothes in a similar approach as an architect might treat, which is interesting. We were just talking about the idea of architecture as garment. And yeah, that was a perfect fusion, I think.
Also, Oscar Niemeyer worked till he was 104 years old. Is that something you think he'll do?
Funnily enough, my teacher, when we did the Motley Theatre design course, she was a wonderful woman called Percy Harris. And she was coming into that studio teaching us every day. And I believe the last day she came to work, she was 103. So yeah, 103, 104. Yeah.
That's a good innings, as they say. I've worked with a lot of contemporary artists who are polymaths like yourself. So I know there's probably some kind of arena that you haven't yet explored, but you're desperate to get into. Is that the case?
Listen, this temporary extinction of the practice has, of course, you know, forced us as a studio to work in a much more digital way than we normally do. We are in the midst of working on a game and a world. And I'm very, very interested in the idea, the sort of Borgesian idea of a one-to-one map overlaid over everything that's there. And I'm speaking very much as a mother who observes the next generation day to day. I'm having a sort of degree in next generation etude through a 10 and 13-year-old who I observe during this period, particularly of lockdown, at very close encounter, you know, than I normally do, because I'd normally be in and out, but I'm with them all day, every day, to a degree, or I certainly was when they weren't going to school during the lockdown. And my observation of these digital natives, and even the 3-year difference in their ages and what that calibration is of digital native approach, even in 3 years difference. I'm very interested in the sort of neuro mirroring that goes on when you are daily in a digital map like Fortnite, and how your memory palace then becomes built up of muscle memory, absorption of these digital places. And I guess my ambition is to see, is there a way to take the energy and the focus through a digital means back out to the physical world, right? Is there a way that rather than the digital becoming a wonderful, beautiful, seductive hall of mirrors in which it's self-sufficient and we don't really need the biosphere, right? Because this hall of mirrors is so profoundly enchanting. Is there a way that the hall of mirrors can keep leading us back out to our connection with the biosphere? That's really what we're focusing on. So yes, I guess this arena of digital placeness, taking everything we've learned about concrete material placeness, and seeing how can that be expressed through purely pixels. That's the next frontier, I guess.
Yeah, and this is very much what we're about with LFF Expanded and these new relationships with technology. But do you think the technology fundamentally changes storytelling? So using whether it's artificial intelligence or digital augmentation, do you think it is a different way of telling stories?
I do. I mean, I spoke about this recently in a talk, so at the risk of repeating myself, I'm going to quote again the wonderful choreographer Akram Khan. During the lockdown, I did a series of interviews actually for a book that we're making, and I interviewed a lot of my peers and colleagues, and Akram so brilliantly expressed this. He said, listen, what he was grieving most in this period of temporary hibernation, extinction of our live theatre performance practice, music practice, he said the quality of time when you were performing, when you were sitting in a dark auditorium, receiving a performance, time passes in a way that's not governed by mechanics or by digits. It's the way that time has always passed, for millennia prior to the onset of mechanical and digital forms of timekeeping. And it's a storytelling time. It's a time where seconds and hours are expandable or contractible depending on the quality of story. And it's the way that our bodies have evolved, and our minds and our muscles, everything about us evolved to be able to live in this way and to receive story in this way and to define our inner selves in this way, I guess. And I think that the key thing we have to learn from this period of temporary extinction is what we would miss if this part of us were to become permanently extinct. I think it's a rehearsal for part of us becoming extinct. And actually it's already to a degree happening. Like when you watch a pop show, occasionally you'll notice that the lights are moving in a certain way, and it's because they are running off time code. So the time code is the digital driver that's telling the video what to do, telling the lighting what to do, and is all derived from a click based in the core of the music, right? So in theory, it's a wonderful, and in practice, it's a fantastic way to keep everything together. But in our hearts, we know that this is being digitally driven, right? And there's a very great difference when a band turns the track off and you know that the only real beat that's driving the performance is breath, the human breath of the audience and the performer, syncing with each other. And we mustn't let, I don't think, I would advise that we protect and nurture that part of ourselves. And maybe this little rehearsal extinction will give us pause and make us treasure and value that part of ourselves and try and prevent its extinction. I mean, that said, there are fantastic ways through, virtual experience, the neuro mirroring, even I went for a swim in Fortnite. I couldn't go for a swim anywhere else. It was really refreshing. We've done some research. A play we did called Ugly Lies the Bone was all about a burns victim who really was genuinely aided in her healing by the experience of spending time in virtual worlds that were freezing. So there's no doubt that this is a fabulously rich next frontier for all of us. And I'm not in any way being, Luddite about it. I just think let's preserve the animal in us as well as the digital creature.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect way to end the screen talk and conversation. And I think that's, such a big thing to think about and how we move forward from this particular moment in time. So Ez, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you for being our very first LFF Expanded Screen Talk. Good luck with all your future projects, and Thank you.
Thank you so much.